There's a morning in history that no one expected. Not the disciples, who were hiding behind locked doors, terrified that what had happened to their teacher would happen to them next. Not the women, who were walking through the dark streets of Jerusalem before sunrise, carrying spices to anoint a corpse, not expecting anything other than a sealed stone and a guarded tomb. Not the Roman soldiers, stationed at the entrance to that tomb by direct order of Pontius Pilate, fulfilling a duty they considered routine. Not the chief priests, who had spent Thursday night and Friday orchestrating the execution of the man they feared, and who now thought the problem was resolved. Nobody in that city, on that morning, woke up thinking, today everything changes. But it did. The year is 33 AD. The city is Jerusalem. And what you're about to walk through is not simply a religious event preserved in ancient texts. It is the morning that broke the calendar of human history in two. The single event around which more has been written, more has been argued, more has been lived and died for than any other moment in the story of civilization. Hour by hour, detail by detail, stone by stone. This is what resurrection morning actually looked like. To understand what happened on that Sunday morning in Jerusalem, you first need to understand the city itself, not as a distant religious symbol, but as a real, breathing, complicated place on a specific day in history. The Passover week of 33 AD had been extraordinary even by Jerusalem's own standards. The city's normal population of approximately 80,000 inhabitants had been swollen to somewhere between 150,000 and 300,000 pilgrims. Estimates derive from the records of sacrificial animals processed through the temple during that feast period. People had come from Galilee, from the Decapolis, from Egypt, from Babylon, from Rome itself. The city had been packed beyond its capacity for days. By Sunday morning, the day after the Sabbath, many of those pilgrims were beginning to leave. The roads out of Jerusalem were filling with caravans heading north toward Galilee, south toward Egypt, west toward the coast. The Passover was over. Life was returning to its ordinary rhythms. The city was exhaling. And somewhere in that returning normalcy, in a tomb cut from limestone rock on the western slope of the city, something was happening that would make everything that came before it seem, in retrospect, like a prologue. Friday's crucifixion had not resolved the tension in Jerusalem. It had simply shifted it. The chief priests and Pharisees, according to Matthew's account, went to Pilate on the Sabbath, a remarkable act in itself, since traveling to the Roman governor on the Sabbath was a significant concession of religious scruple, and made an unusual request. They asked for a guard to be posted at the tomb. Their reasoning was specific. They were afraid that Jesus' disciples might come and steal the body, and then claim that he had risen from the dead. They remembered that Jesus had predicted his own resurrection after 3 days. They wanted to prevent that prediction from being falsely claimed as fulfilled. Pilate's response, "You have a guard, go make it as secure as you know how," indicates that Roman soldiers were assigned to that tomb. Not the temple guard under Jewish command, but Roman soldiers under Pilate's authority. This is a historically significant detail because it means the security of that tomb was a Roman military matter, and Roman soldiers who failed in their duty faced execution. The tomb was sealed and guarded. From a purely human standpoint, it was as secure as the most powerful empire in the world could make it. The tomb itself, the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, the wealthy member of the Sanhedrin who had asked Pilate for the body and provided his own newly cut burial monument, was not a simple cave. It was an expensive, high-status structure of the kind that only the most affluent families in Jerusalem could afford. Archaeological excavations of first-century Jewish tombs in the Jerusalem area have revealed a consistent architectural pattern for elite burials: a carved stone antechamber leading into a main burial chamber, with narrow horizontal shafts cut into the rock walls in which bodies were placed. The entrance was sealed with a large disc-shaped stone called a galil, set into a sloped channel and rolled into place, where its own weight locked it securely against the entrance. These galil stones were massive. Estimates based on the size of typical tomb entrances from this period suggest weights of 1 to 2 tons. They were designed to be rolled into place by several men working together, and to be extremely difficult to remove. The women walking toward the tomb that Sunday morning knew this. Their own question to each other on the way, who will roll the stone away from the entrance, was not a trivial worry. It was a genuine logistical problem. Whatever happened to that stone by the time they arrived was not the work of frightened disciples in the middle of the night. Now, every account of resurrection morning agrees on one thing. The first people to discover the empty tomb were women. This detail is, from a purely historical standpoint, one of the strongest arguments for the authenticity of the resurrection accounts. In first-century Jewish culture, a woman's testimony was not considered valid evidence in a court of law. The historian Josephus, writing in the late 1st century, explicitly states that women were not accepted as witnesses in Jewish legal proceedings. This was not a fringe opinion. It reflected the standard legal practice of the time. If the resurrection narrative had been invented, if it were a story fabricated by early followers trying to make their executed teacher seem more significant than he was, no one inventing that story in a first-century Jewish context would have placed women as the primary witnesses. It would have been self-defeating. The invention would have included male disciples, prominent figures, witnesses whose testimony carried legal and social weight. The presence of women as the first witnesses is an embarrassing detail, historically speaking. And embarrassing details in ancient sources are typically signs that those details are true, because no one invents what embarrasses them. The four gospel accounts together give us a picture of a group of women who had followed Jesus from Galilee, who had been present at the crucifixion when most of the male disciples had fled, and who had watched where the body was laid on Friday evening. Mary Magdalene is named in all four Gospels as the central figure. She had been, by Jesus' own act, liberated from a condition the text describes as 7 demons, a phrase that in the medical framework of the ancient world indicated severe and chronic suffering, whether psychological, neurological, or spiritual. She was not a reformed prostitute. That conflation came from a 6th century sermon by Pope Gregory I and has no basis in the New Testament text. She was a woman of means, one of a group of women who financially supported Jesus' ministry, and she was present at the cross and the tomb when almost everyone else had abandoned him. The other women varied by account: Mary, the mother of James, Salome, Joanna. But the consistency across all four Gospels in placing Mary Magdalene at the center of this discovery is remarkable given the variations in other details. John's account says it was still dark when Mary Magdalene set out for the tomb. Mark says the women came to the tomb very early in the morning, when the sun had risen. These are not contradictions. They describe a journey that began in darkness and arrived at or just after first light, which at that latitude in early spring would have been around 5:30 to 6 in the morning. Imagine that walk through Jerusalem. The streets of the lower city would have been nearly empty, the sound of sandals on stone pavement echoing between limestone walls. The city still cool and quiet, with the first gray light beginning to dilute the darkness. A smell of smoke and cooking already starting to drift from the houses where families were preparing for an ordinary Sunday morning. These women were carrying burial spices, myrrh, aloes, possibly nard, costly aromatic substances used to mask the odor of decomposition and to honor the dead according to Jewish custom. They were going to do for Jesus' body what the rush of Friday evening's events had prevented them from doing properly before the Sabbath began: anoint him fully, wrap him carefully, bid him goodbye. They were not going to meet a risen Lord. They were going to prepare a corpse. The detail Mark preserves, that on the way they were asking each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb, is extraordinarily revealing. They had seen where the body was laid. They had watched the stone rolled into place. They knew it was there, and they were going anyway without a plan for how to move it, because they could not go. The combination of grief, devotion, and the obligations of burial custom meant they were walking toward an obstacle they could not solve, because the alternative, staying away, was unthinkable. This is not the behavior of people who are planning to manufacture an empty tomb. This is the behavior of people in grief who are going through the motions of love, even when those motions seem futile. When they arrived, the stone had already been rolled away. Matthew's account provides the only description of how that happened. An earthquake, and an angel whose appearance was like lightning and whose clothing was white as snow, before whom the guards shook with fear and became like dead men. Whatever Matthew is describing, it was an event of such physical power that trained Roman soldiers were rendered unconscious or paralyzed with terror. The women entered the tomb, and what they found inside was a specific arrangement of objects that John's Gospel preserves with the precision of an eyewitness detail. The burial cloths were lying there, not thrown aside in the disorder of a body hastily removed, not scattered by grave robbers. They were lying there in the position where a body had been, and the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head was not lying with the linen strips. It was folded up by itself, separate from them. Scholars have debated the significance of this detail for centuries, but all interpretations share a common inference. This was not the scene of a robbery. Grave robbers in first-century Jerusalem did not unwrap bodies. They took the burial cloths along with the body, since fine linen was valuable. They certainly did not pause to fold the headcloth and lay it separately. Whatever happened in that tomb, it happened in a manner that left the burial cloths intact, in place, folded, as if the body had simply passed through them. When Mary Magdalene saw the open tomb, she did not stop to investigate. She ran. John's account says she ran to Simon Peter and to the other disciple, the one Jesus loved. The circumlocution that most scholars identify with John himself, the author of the fourth gospel. Her message was urgent and specific. They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him. She was not announcing a resurrection. She was reporting a desecration. Her first interpretation of the empty tomb was the most logical one available to her. The body had been moved, either by the authorities who wanted to prevent the tomb from becoming a site of veneration, or by persons unknown. The two disciples received her message and ran. John's account of what happens next is one of the most peculiarly specific passages in all of Scripture. It tells us that the two disciples ran, that the other disciple outran Peter, reached the tomb first, looked in and saw the linen cloths lying there, and then stopped at the entrance. Peter, arriving second, went straight in. The reason the other disciple stopped at the entrance, and this is a detail that most modern readers miss completely, almost certainly had to do with Jewish ritual purity law. Tombs were a primary source of corpse impurity in the Levitical system. A Jew who entered a tomb containing a corpse contracted a 7-day impurity that required an elaborate purification ritual. The other disciple hesitated at the threshold, pausing at the boundary between the ritually clean outside world and the potentially impure interior. Peter had no such hesitation. He went in, and what he saw, the specific arrangement of the burial cloths, the headcloth folded separately, is what John then says caused the other disciple to enter, see, and believe. Believe what exactly? John is careful about this. He says, "For as yet they did not understand the Scripture, that he must rise from the dead." Their belief in that moment was not yet a fully formed theology of resurrection. It was the beginning of comprehension, the first crack of light through a door that would open wider over the next 40 days. The next line of John's account is as understated as it is strange. Then the disciples went back to where they were staying. They went home. They saw the empty tomb and went home. This is not the behavior of men who have manufactured a resurrection story. This is the behavior of men who are profoundly confused, who have seen something that does not fit any category they possess, who need time to process, who do not yet know what to do with what they have seen. What happened next did not happen to Peter or to John. It happened to the woman who had lingered behind. After Peter and John left, Mary Magdalene stood outside the tomb weeping. That verb, stood, is worth pausing on. The disciples had come and gone. The mystery had confronted them, and they had retreated into confusion. Mary did not retreat. She stood. Grief had rooted her to the spot. And then she bent over and looked into the tomb. What she saw there John describes with a serenity that contrasts completely with the emotional landscape of the moment. Two angels in white, sitting where the body of Jesus had been, one at the head, one at the feet. The posture and placement is significant. It mirrors, deliberately, the cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant described in Exodus 25, one at each end of the mercy seat. The empty space between them, where the body of Jesus had lain, is being presented as the new mercy seat, the new place where heaven and earth meet. But Mary, through her tears, may have seen none of that symbolism. She just knew the body was gone. The angels asked her why she was weeping. She gave them the same answer she had given Peter and John. Someone had taken the Lord, and she did not know where he was. Then she turned around, and there was a man standing there whom she did not recognize. He asked her the same question the angels had asked, and added one more. "Whom are you seeking?" She assumed he was the gardener. It was a reasonable assumption. Who else would be in a garden at dawn? She asked him directly. If he had moved the body, would he tell her where it was so she could retrieve it? She said this without explaining who she meant, as if it was obvious, as if there could be no other person worth speaking about. And then he said her name. One word. Her name. That is all it took. The Gospel of John, which has been building since its opening chapter toward the image of the shepherd who calls his own sheep by name. The shepherd whose sheep recognize his voice, arrives at its destination in that single syllable. She turned, and she said to him, in Aramaic, the word that meant teacher, Rabboni. The recognition was not visual. She was looking at him and did not know him. It was sonic. It was personal. It was the voice that had known her name before she had offered it, the voice that had spoken into the disorder of her life and brought order, speaking again from the other side of the most complete disorder imaginable, death itself. And what it said was simply, "You." Her response was to hold on to him. John chapter 20 records Jesus saying, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father." The Greek verb used here, haptu, is in the present imperative form, which in Greek typically refers to the cessation of an ongoing action. She was already holding on. He was not forbidding a greeting. He was releasing her from an embrace she had begun, gently, but clearly. This is not a prohibition on touching the risen Jesus. A few verses later, he will invite Thomas to put his hands into his wounds. This is something more tender and more precise. She is holding on because she is afraid he will disappear again. She is trying to prevent another loss by sheer physical grip. And he is saying, "You cannot hold the resurrection in your hands. What is happening now is different. I am not staying here. The direction is not back, it is forward. Go. You have a message to carry." Jesus gave Mary Magdalene a commission. Go to my brothers and tell them. In the technical vocabulary of the New Testament, an apostle is one who is sent. Apostello in Greek means to send. Mary Magdalene, on the morning of the resurrection, before Peter had received an appearance, before the 11 had been commissioned, was sent by Jesus himself to carry the message of the resurrection. The early church Father Hippolytus of Rome, writing in the 3rd century, called her Apostola Apostolorum, the apostle of the apostles. Not because she held an office, but because the risen Lord chose her to carry the first resurrection announcement. She went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." 5 words. 5 words that are the hinge of human history. Now I want to stop here and go somewhere that most video treatments of the resurrection never go, into the historical evidence itself. Because the resurrection is not simply a matter of faith. It is a historical claim. It happened in a real city, in a real tomb, to a real body. And the evidence for it is extraordinary. The most important document for understanding the historical evidence is not the gospel accounts. It is a text written approximately 20 years before the earliest gospel, by a man who had personally persecuted followers of Jesus, and then became the most prolific writer in the New Testament. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, written around 54 to 55 AD, contains a formal creedal statement that Paul explicitly says he received. The Greek word paralambano indicating that this was transmitted tradition, something he was passing on, not composing. Scholars date the origin of this creed to within 2 to 5 years of the crucifixion itself, making it the earliest written statement about the resurrection in existence. Paul writes that the risen Christ appeared to Peter, then to the 12, then to more than 500 brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom, Paul adds, are still living. That parenthetical is crucial. Paul was inviting verification. He was saying, "These people are alive, go ask them." He would not have written that if the appearances were invented. An invented claim does not invite the reader to go check with the 500 witnesses. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence for the historical reality of the empty tomb is the nature of the earliest opposition to the resurrection claim. Matthew's gospel records that the chief priests, when told by the guard what had happened, gave the soldiers money and told them to say, "His disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep." Matthew then adds, "This story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day." This is historically extraordinary. The opponents of early Christianity, people with every motivation to disprove the resurrection, chose to spread a story that assumed the tomb was empty. They did not say, "The body is still in the tomb. Come and see." They said, "The disciples took it." If the tomb had not been empty, the simplest refutation of the resurrection claim would have been to produce the body. Jerusalem was a small city. The tomb's location was known. The chief priests had personally secured a guard from Pilate. If the body of Jesus had still been in that tomb on Sunday morning, the resurrection movement would have ended that same week. It did not end. It spread, first in Jerusalem itself, the one city where any refutation based on the body would have been most immediately available, then outward through the Roman world with a speed that has no parallel in the history of religious movements. Perhaps the most historically puzzling aspect of the resurrection is the transformation of the disciples between Friday evening and the following weeks. On Friday afternoon, when Jesus was crucified, his closest followers fled. John's Gospel preserves the detail that they were meeting behind locked doors for fear. Peter, who had publicly denied knowing Jesus 3 times the night before, was in that room. The movement looked from every external perspective finished. Within weeks, these same men were standing in the public spaces of Jerusalem, the city where their teacher had just been executed by the combined authority of the Roman governor and the Jewish religious establishment, publicly proclaiming that he had risen from the dead. And when they were arrested and beaten for doing so, they kept doing it. People do not die for what they know to be a lie. People die for what they believe to be true. But the disciples were not dying for a faith that someone else had handed them. They were dying for what they themselves claimed to have seen. They were in the unique position of knowing, from their own direct experience, whether the resurrection had happened or not. And they chose to die rather than recant it. Every generation since the first century has proposed alternative explanations for the empty tomb and the resurrection appearances. The body was stolen by disciples. But who dies for a theft they themselves committed? The women went to the wrong tomb, but Peter and John also went, and the authorities never corrected the error by pointing to the right one. Jesus did not actually die, but recovered in the tomb. But Roman soldiers, professionally trained in the mechanics of crucifixion, certified his death before releasing the body. Each alternative explanation solves one piece of the puzzle by creating larger problems elsewhere. The only explanation that accounts for all the data, the empty tomb, the grave cloths, the appearances, the transformation of the disciples, the explosive growth of the movement in the very city where the tomb was located, is the one the disciples themselves gave from the beginning. He is risen. Luke chapter 24 records what is, in many ways, the most humanly intimate of all the resurrection appearances. 2 disciples walking from Jerusalem to the village of Emmaus, a journey of about 7 miles, on the afternoon of that same Sunday. They were walking and discussing everything that had happened: the betrayal, the trial, the crucifixion, the reports of the empty tomb, which they had heard but apparently found impossible to process. And a stranger fell in step with them. The text says their eyes were kept from recognizing him. Whether this was a physical limitation, a supernatural intervention, or simply the disorientation of grief, meeting the completely unexpected. What it describes is 2 people having a conversation with the risen Jesus without knowing it was him. The stranger asked them what they were talking about. They stopped walking. Their faces were downcast. One of them, identified as Cleopas, answered with a mixture of sorrow and bewildered hope, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" They told him about Jesus of Nazareth, about how they had hoped he was the one to redeem Israel, about the crucifixion, about the women who had found the empty tomb that morning, about how some of the disciples had confirmed the tomb was empty but had not seen Jesus. And then the stranger began to talk, starting from Moses and working through all the prophets. He opened for them the meaning of the scriptures as they related to the Messiah, that it was necessary for the Messiah to suffer these things before entering his glory. Luke doesn't give us the content of that exposition, and it is one of the great losses of the text that he does not. We are left to imagine what it sounded like to have the full arc of Old Testament prophecy explained by the one in whom it had all been fulfilled. When they arrived at the village, the stranger seemed to be going on. They pressed him to stay. He sat with them at the table. He took the bread, gave thanks, broke it, and at that moment of breaking, their eyes were opened, and he vanished from their sight. They turned to each other and said, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road, while he opened the scriptures to us?" And they got up and returned immediately to Jerusalem, 7 miles in the dark because they had to tell the others. Think about that for a moment. 7 miles on foot at night after a full day of travel. Grief had kept them in Jerusalem for days, and one encounter on a road had given them enough energy to walk back in the dark. That is what a resurrection appearance does to a person. That is what happens when the stranger at your table breaks the bread. Luke records, almost in passing, that when the 2 Emmaus disciples returned to Jerusalem and found the 11 gathered together, the group greeted them with this: "The Lord has really risen and has appeared to Simon." This reference to an appearance to Peter is given without any description. We're not told what was said, where it happened, what it looked like. We know from Paul's creed in 1 Corinthians that it was the first resurrection appearance to one of the 12. We know from the trajectory of Peter's story, from a man who denied Jesus 3 times on Thursday night to the man who stood in Jerusalem 50 days later and preached to thousands, that whatever happened in that meeting transformed him completely. The encounter between the risen Christ and the man who had denied him 3 times is one of the untold stories of the New Testament, and its absence from the text is itself a kind of eloquence. Some things between a person and the one who loves them most are too personal, too internal, too complete to be put into narrative. We are given the before and the after. The content of the meeting is held between Peter and the Lord. The final resurrection appearance of that first day is described in both Luke and John. Jesus appeared to the gathered disciples, with the exception of Thomas, who was not present, in a locked room in Jerusalem on the evening of that same Sunday. John's account gives a detail of particular significance. Jesus showed them his hands and his side. This was not a spiritual vision. This was not a symbol or an allegory. He showed them the physical evidence of the crucifixion on a body that was now standing in a locked room. The resurrection body of Jesus was neither simply his pre-death body resuscitated. He passed through locked doors, he appeared and disappeared. Nor was it a purely spiritual entity without physical substance. It was something genuinely new, a body that bore the marks of history, that could eat and be touched, that occupied physical space, and that was also no longer constrained by the physical laws that govern ordinary matter. Thomas, the disciple who would later say he would not believe unless he put his fingers in the nail marks and his hand into the side, was not present that evening. He would not receive his own encounter with the risen Christ until 8 days later, when Jesus appeared again and offered him exactly the physical proof he had demanded. And what Jesus said to Thomas in that moment has echoed through 20 centuries of faith. "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." He was talking about you. He was talking about every person who has come to faith without having been in that room, without having seen the nail marks, without having heard their names spoken in a garden, without having walked the Emmaus road and felt their heart burning. The beatitude of Easter Sunday evening is not for those who are there. It is for everyone who has believed on the basis of their witness. The Apostle Paul, writing to the church in Corinth, made a statement so stark in its logic that it has unsettled readers ever since. If Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. You are still in your sins. And if Christ has not been raised, then those who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. If in this life only we have hoped in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied. Paul is not hedging. He is not offering a spiritualized version of Christianity that would survive the disproof of the resurrection. He is saying the whole thing stands or falls on a single historical event. Either Jesus rose bodily from the dead, or everything else is worthless. That is a remarkable thing to say, and it is the position of the New Testament from beginning to end. Jesus had made claims that were, by any measure, astonishing. He claimed to forgive sins, which, as the religious leaders immediately recognized, only God could do. He claimed that his words would outlast heaven and earth. He claimed to be the way, the truth, and the life. He claimed, in the most direct possible terms, to be one with the Father. These claims, if false, do not make Jesus an admirable moral teacher. They make him either deceived about his own identity or a deliberate deceiver of others. There is no comfortable middle ground. The resurrection is the answer. It is God's own verdict on Jesus' claims. By raising him from the dead, the Father was declaring, in the most unambiguous possible language available in the physical world, that everything Jesus said was true. The resurrection is not a separate miracle added to Jesus' ministry. It is the divine ratification of his entire existence. One of the most important things to understand about the resurrection is that, in the framework of a New Testament, it is not primarily about Jesus escaping death. It is about the defeat of death itself and the beginning of a new creation. Paul calls Jesus the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. First fruits was a Jewish agricultural and liturgical concept. The first portion of the harvest offered to God as a pledge and guarantee of the rest. Jesus' resurrection is not a private miracle. It is the beginning of a universal process. The stone has been rolled not just from one tomb, but from the doorway of death itself. The New Testament does not present the resurrection as the recovery of what was. It presents it as the inauguration of what will be. The resurrection body of Jesus is not a return to Eden. It is the prototype of a new creation, a body no longer subject to decay or death, still bearing the marks of history and suffering, but transformed into something that belongs to a new order of existence. And that, Paul argues, is where the whole human story is heading. Not to the immortality of the soul floating free of matter in some spiritual cloud, to the resurrection of the body in a renewed creation where the last enemy, death, has been swallowed up in victory. The Sunday morning that began in a garden with a woman weeping over a missing body ends with a promise that encompasses every human being who has ever lived, every burial ground, every tomb, every grief, every loss. This is not how the story ends. Now I want to ask you something honest, and I want you to take it somewhere real before you answer. Has there ever been a moment in your life when you were walking towards something you did not know how to face, and the obstacle was already removed when you got there? A conversation you dreaded that someone else had already had. A door you thought was closed that had already been opened. A stone you had no idea how to move that was already rolled away. The women walked toward that tomb with a real problem they had no solution for. They had been discussing it the entire walk. And the solution was already in place before they arrived, by a power that had been working in the dark while they slept. Tell me about your stone. Tell me about the moment something that should have been impossible had already been handled by a force you could not see. Write it in the comments. I read every single one, and I want this community to hear how the God of Resurrection Sunday is still moving stones in the 21st century, in real lives, in real situations, for real people who walk toward their problems with nothing but love and the inability to stay away. Your story matters. Put in the comments. Resurrection morning was not an event that was meant to stay in a garden. Mary Magdalene received a commission from the risen Lord before the sun was fully up. Go and tell. The two disciples from Emmaus walked 7 miles in the dark to tell the others. The women who first found the empty tomb ran from it with fear and great joy to carry the news. The resurrection has always traveled by word of mouth, from person to person, From one who has heard to one who has not yet heard. Right now, someone in your life is in a Saturday, stuck between the Friday of their pain and the Sunday they cannot see yet, carrying a grief that has no category, facing a stone they cannot move, living through the day when heaven seems silent and hope seems like something that belongs to other people. They need to hear that the stone was already moved. They need to hear that the tomb was already empty. They need to hear that the one who stood in a garden and said a woman's name is the same one who knows theirs. Share this video with that person. You do not need to explain it. You do not need to have the right words. Just send it. Be the messenger that resurrection mourning needs in the 21st century. And if you're not yet part of this community, subscribe today. Every week we walk together through the truths that hold the faith with the same depth, the same detail, the same empty tomb at the center of everything. We are not finished. The story goes on, and so do we. But before we leave that garden moment, the moment of Mary and the risen Jesus, there is something about it that deserves more time. Because it is easy to read the resurrection narratives too quickly, to move through them at the pace of someone checking boxes in a story they already know, and to miss the weight of what is being described. Mary Magdalene had been present at the crucifixion. She had stood near the cross, according to John's Gospel, along with the mother of Jesus and one other disciple, while the rest had fled. She had watched him die, not from a distance, not from behind a crowd, but close enough to hear the sounds of crucifixion, close enough to see his face. She had then watched where the body was laid on Friday evening, tracking every movement of the burial, so that she would know exactly where to come back once the Sabbath was over. And now she was in a garden at dawn, and the tomb was empty, and she had already told Peter and John, and they had come and gone, and she was alone again, and she was weeping. The word John uses for her weeping, kleo, describes loud, audible sobbing, not quiet tears. She was not composed. She was broken. And the question the angels asked her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And then the question the unrecognized Jesus asked her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" are not cold or clinical questions. In the mouth of the one who had wept at the tomb of Lazarus, the one who had looked out over Jerusalem and wept over the city, they are questions of extraordinary tenderness. The risen Lord encountered his most devoted follower in the ruins of her grief, and his first words to her were a question about her pain. He did not immediately reveal himself. He asked her why she was hurting. That is worth sitting with for a long time. And then her name, Mary. There is a Jewish tradition, preserved in rabbinic literature, that the Good Shepherd knows each sheep by name. Jesus had said in John chapter 10 that he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. The resurrection appearance to Mary Magdalene is the living enactment of that image. The shepherd, returned from death itself, finds the one sheep who could not leave, who is still standing at the place where she had last seen him, and he calls her by name. And she knows his voice. Now, let us go somewhere else on that same morning. Because while Mary was in the garden and Peter and John were making their way back from the tomb, something was happening at the Roman guard post that is recorded only partially, and that partial record is itself a remarkable piece of historical evidence. Matthew chapter 28 tells us that when Jesus rose, there was a great earthquake and the appearance of the angel that rolled away the stone. The guards shook with fear and became like dead men. Some of them then went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. Read that again. The soldiers who had been posted to prevent any interference with the tomb went and told the chief priests, the very people who had requested the guard, what they had witnessed. The chief priest's response is one of the most telling moments in the entire Passion narrative. They did not launch an investigation. They did not go to inspect the tomb themselves. They did not send anyone to look for the body. They gathered with the elders, discussed the situation, and gave the soldiers a large sum of money with specific instructions. Say that his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. Think about the logic of that bribe. If the guards were asleep, they would have no knowledge of what happened. So their testimony about a theft would be worthless in any legal proceeding. And Roman soldiers who slept on duty faced the death penalty. The chief priests had to add, "If this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. They were bribing soldiers to give false testimony. They were offering protection against the legal consequences of that false testimony. And they were doing all of this rather than the one thing that would have ended the problem immediately if the body were still in the tomb. Go to show it. Their response to the resurrection is not the response of people who know the body is still there. It is the response of people who know the tomb is empty and are desperate to explain away. Let us now go deeper into something that is often overlooked in discussions of the resurrection: the role of the Sabbath in what had happened, and what the disciples understood about time in those 3 days. The Jewish Sabbath ran from Friday evening to Saturday evening. During those approximately 24 hours, the disciples could do nothing. They could not go to the tomb. They could not gather publicly. They were confined to where they were staying, locked behind doors, in the particular agony of a grief that could not yet even be expressed through the physical rituals that Jewish culture had designed for exactly this purpose. The Sabbath after the crucifixion is the silence at the center of the Christian story. It is a silence that every person who has ever experienced catastrophic loss knows intimately. The day after the worst thing happens, when the world insists on continuing its ordinary rhythms. The sun rises, people cook breakfast, life proceeds, and you are sitting in the wreckage of something that cannot be undone. The Sabbath between crucifixion and resurrection is that day, multiplied to its ultimate degree. And then Sunday came. In the Jewish week, Sunday was not a day of rest. It was the first day of the working week, the day on which life resumed after the Sabbath. The women set out before dawn because Sunday was the first moment they legally could, the first moment the restrictions of Sabbath observance lifted and they could carry out the work of burial that had been interrupted. They were resuming. They were going back to finish what had been started. They had no framework for what they were about to find. The disciples, in the days and weeks that followed, had to develop an entirely new theological framework to understand what had happened. The resurrection of the dead was not an unknown concept in Judaism. The Pharisees believed in a general resurrection at the end of time, and Martha had articulated that belief to Jesus before the raising of Lazarus. But the resurrection of one specific person in the middle of history before the end of all things, that had no precedent. This is why the disciples' behavior in the immediate aftermath of the empty tomb is so strange. They had heard Jesus predict his resurrection multiple times, and yet when confronted with the evidence of it, they were confused, slow to believe, inclined toward natural explanations. Their own predictions gave them no immunity to surprise, because the thing they were encountering was genuinely unprecedented, not resurrection as they understood it, the general raising of all the dead at the end of time, but resurrection as something that had already happened in the middle of history to one person, leaving an empty tomb and a folded headcloth, and a risen Lord who appeared in locked rooms and broke bread on a road and spoke a woman's name in a garden. They had to rebuild their entire understanding of what God was doing in the world around this single, unrepeatable event. And they did. And the results of that rebuilding, the letters of Paul, the 4 Gospels, the book of Revelation, have shaped the intellectual and spiritual landscape of human civilization for 2,000 years. Now, there is one more appearance from those 40 days after the resurrection that deserves careful attention, because it contains something that Jesus said that often gets read past too quickly. Near the end of John's Gospel, in chapter 21, the risen Jesus appeared to several disciples who had gone back to fishing on the Sea of Galilee. They had been fishing all night without catching anything. A figure on the shore called out to them, "Have you caught any fish?" They said no. He told them to cast the net on the right side of the boat. They caught 153 fish. John records the number with the precision of someone who counted. And then, on the shore, over a charcoal fire, the same kind of fire around which Peter had stood when he denied Jesus 3 times, Jesus had breakfast with them. And he asked Peter 3 times whether Peter loved him. 3 times the denial. 3 times the question. 3 times the restoration. And then Jesus said something to Peter that contains a truth the whole resurrection narrative is pointing toward. When you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, You will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. John adds the explanation. Jesus said this to show by what kind of death Peter would glorify God. The resurrection appearance to Peter was not simply a moment of personal restoration for a man who had failed badly. It was the commissioning of a martyr. Jesus restored Peter and then told him that the road ahead would lead to a cross of his own. And Peter accepted it. The man who had denied Jesus 3 times while standing by a charcoal fire accepted, beside another charcoal fire, that following Jesus would cost him everything. This is the trajectory of the resurrection. It does not lead away from the cross. It leads through it. The risen Christ does not promise his followers an easier path. He promises them a companion for the hard path and an outcome that death cannot reach. The resurrection changes the calculus of everything. If Jesus is risen, then death is not the end. And if death is not the end, then the martyrs who died rather than deny him were not fools. They were the most rational people in the room. They were betting on the only thing in human history that has ever given anyone a reason to believe that the grave is not the final word. And they bet everything on it. And the movement they began in Jerusalem, in the city where the tomb was, within weeks of the events, has never stopped. 20 centuries later, it is the largest movement in human history, with followers on every continent, in every language, in every culture that human civilization has produced. That is not an argument for the resurrection by itself. Large movements have been built on false premises before, but it is evidence of something. A lie, told by frightened men in a locked room, does not typically produce 20 centuries of martyrdom, scholarship, art, music, and moral transformation across the entire span of human civilization. Something happened in Jerusalem on that Sunday morning. And the people who were there, who had the most direct access to the evidence, who had the most to lose by staking their lives on it, who knew better than anyone what they had seen and what they had not seen, went to their deaths insisting on what it was. He is risen. There is one dimension of what happened in those 3 days that is almost never discussed in video treatments of the resurrection, and it is worth giving it the time it deserves. It has to do with the experience of the women and of all the followers of Jesus during the hours between the crucifixion on Friday afternoon and the dawn of Sunday morning. The Jewish day, as we noted, began at sundown. So from a moment Jesus died on the cross, which the Gospels locate at around 3 in the afternoon on Friday, until the first light of Sunday morning, approximately 40 hours passed. 40 hours in which, from the perspective of everyone who had followed Jesus, everything was over. The dreams were finished. The movement had failed. The man they had believed was the Messiah, the Son of the living God, the one who would redeem Israel, had died the death of a criminal and a slave, publicly, humiliatingly, in full view of the religious and political establishments of his world. There was no way to interpret this as anything other than defeat. The psychology of those 40 hours is something that the Church, in its liturgical wisdom, has tried to preserve in the observance of Holy Saturday, the day between Good Friday and Easter Sunday. It is the day of silence, the day of waiting, the day when faith has nothing to hold on to because everything it was holding on to is gone. And yet those women woke up before sunrise on Sunday and went to the tomb anyway. Not because they expected a resurrection, not because they had a theological framework that told them to wait for the 3rd day, but because love does not know how to stop, because grief, when it is the grief of genuine devotion, keeps moving toward the object of its love even when that object is no longer there. Because you go and anoint the body not because it accomplishes anything, but because it is the last thing you can do, and so you do it. And into that last act of love that expected nothing, into the carrying of spices toward a sealed tomb by women who had no plan for the stone, the resurrection came. That pattern is worth holding on to. The resurrection did not come to people who had correctly calculated that it would happen. It came to people who were faithful to what they knew and kept moving toward what they loved. The theological understanding came afterward, built on the experience. The experience itself came to people who were just trying to do the last loving thing they could think of in the ruins of their hope. That is not an accident. That is a portrait of how the resurrection still enters lives today. Not typically into the confident expectation of people who have the theology perfectly worked out, into the faithful movement of people who keep going toward what they love, even when they cannot see what waits for them at the end of the road. Keep walking. The stone may already be moved. Now I want to ask you something honest, and I want you to take it somewhere real before you answer. Has there ever been a moment in your life when you were walking towards something you did not know how to face, and the obstacle was already removed when you got there? A conversation you dreaded that someone else had already had. A door you thought was closed that had already been opened. A stone you had no idea how to move that was already rolled away. The women walked toward that tomb with a real problem they had no solution for. They had been discussing it the entire walk. And the solution was already in place before they arrived, by a power that had been working in the dark while they slept. Tell me about your stone. Tell me about the moment something that should have been impossible had already been handled by a force you could not see. Write it in the comments. I read every single one, and I want this community to hear how the God of Resurrection Sunday is still moving stones in the 21st century, in real lives, in real situations, for real people who walk toward their problems with nothing but love and the inability to stay away. Your story matters. Put it in the comments. Resurrection morning was not an event that was meant to stay in a garden. Mary Magdalene received a commission from the risen Lord before the sun was fully up. Go and tell. The 2 disciples from Emmaus walked 7 miles in the dark to tell the others. The women who first found the empty tomb ran from it with fear and great joy to carry the news. The resurrection has always traveled by word of mouth, from person to person, from one who has heard to one who has not yet heard. Right now, someone in your life is in a Saturday, stuck between the Friday of their pain and the Sunday they cannot see yet, carrying a grief that has no category, facing a stone they cannot move. Living through the day when heaven seems silent and hope seems like something that belongs to other people. They need to hear that the stone was already moved. They need to hear that the tomb was already empty. They need to hear that the one who stood in a garden and said a woman's name is the same one who knows theirs. Share this video with that person. You do not need to explain it. You do not need to have the right words. Just send it. Be the messenger that resurrection morning needs in the 21st century. And if you're not yet part of this community, subscribe today. Every week we walk together through the truths that hold the faith with the same depth, the same detail, the same empty tomb at the center of everything. We are not finished. The story goes on, and so do we.